we turned to data. We ran some numbers. We identified some small towns in rural America where I had never visited before, and together we had Matt Dunn joined our team. He had run AmeriCorps Vista for years, had a deep network of connections throughout different parts of the country. And we went on some road trips to places like Anamosa, Iowa, where we were able to convene small groups of community leaders. These are school teachers, principals of schools, CEOs of local hospitals, the journalist, if there was a paper. And we had these small groups where we would ask in a very open-ended way, what are your hopes and your concerns about life in this community? And then from that general opening, we'd ask about the role of media and social media in their lives and what they've seen change over the years. And something I did not expect, we heard, we only had a few of these visits across a couple of trips, but we, even in that short number of visits, started seeing a pattern. We heard something along these lines in multiple conversations. Now that I know what my neighbor really thinks, because they said it on Facebook, I no longer try to talk to them in person. I know there's no point. And to me, the surprise was, even when there was an opportunity and an existing relationship, social media really had become a kind of anti-social force that shut down conversation that used to happen in person. I started thinking of this as a kind of illusion. And I just want to explain why I think this is the social media platforms, which include TikTok and YouTube and a growing proliferation of these different platforms, are creating a kind of illusion. Number one, who's to say that when your neighbor said that in some fast, reactive, emotional context, that is what they really think, as opposed to what they might say if you were in person with that person? Well, there's something about seeing it written down, being able to just focus on it in private that maybe leads to a more kind of indelible imprint than when you are in dialogue. But I think there's no clear reason to say what they said in a fleeting moment in social media is what they really think. So that's one kind of illusion, giving kind of truth value to something from one context over another, and that other context gets blocked. But there's a more general nature to this illusion, which is we now, in theory, can, any of us, and I'm sure most of us do, can get on any of these platforms, or even if you don't, hear from these platforms the voices of others. And this is absolutely true. A couple of billion people are now on these platforms. And so this is a radical change for the human species, to have direct access to others with no intermediaries, or at least that's how it seems. But what's happening is that increasingly it is the extreme points of view that are being amplified in a systematic way, which I'm going to unpack momentarily. And more of us are taking the route of remaining silent, because in various ways it's safer. When you have the confluence of troll culture and cancel culture and various other factors that make these spaces more and more dangerous and unpredictable, it's safer to withdraw, and yet we stay engaged, and we have this sense that if you're curious about someone who is, for me, I live in an urban setting, what are rural Americans like? Well, I can just get on Twitter and find out. Well, what I'm relying on may not at all be representative of what people like that actually are like. And even that person may be conveying something in the context of social media that is very different than if I had the opportunity to sit down with them. But we're not aware of that. There's this massive blind spot to what the actual distorting effect of the platforms are. And because we don't see that, but we do see what seems like direct access, it creates this illusion, like now we know. And the kind of stereotypes and the kind of divergence from reality that I think there's a potential, that's some of the peril of the platforms that I worry about. So that leads me to a kind of paradox, really, of the networked age. If you go and talk to the founders of the internet, of the World Wide Web, the people who imagined these and brought these different platforms into being, none of them realized that by connecting us more and more with one another, we would actually come apart. It is a real, it's perplexing. How could that be? It's supposed to be the global village. We're supposed to all be connected. Why would more connection possibly be a factor in us starting to distance ourselves? Well, there's a pattern that social media fits that long precedes social media, and for that matter, the internet, which is that when we develop technologies that bridge physical distance, and this could be the telephone, or the radio, or the telegraph. It could also be the automobile and the train and airplanes and transportation. It could also be weaponry, how we close distances in taking action at a distance. There's a difference between a knife and a gun, and a machine gun, and a missile. So in each case, progress, for very good reason, we measure as the ability to remove the friction and act at a distance. But that same progress paradoxically introduces a different kind of distance, a kind of interhuman, psychological or psychosocial distance. So we've all experienced this probably. Think about the difference between walking on a sidewalk and your casual, random interactions with strangers, and what happens when we all climb into cars. There's still people in there. It's a social technology. We're interacting, we're changing lanes, we're getting in each other's way, we're letting people pass. But the behavior that often we feel is okay to release. You know, I live in Massachusetts. We have a name for ourselves. We call ourselves massholes. And, you know, it's kind of fun, but actually it's real. So why is that? Why do we feel it's okay more often to behave in a certain way? Well, if you're protected in a container of steel and glass, there's less consequences to how we behave, so there's less of a threat. When others are enclosed in containers, they become kind of abstract. It's easier to forget there's a human inside and instead focus on the car. At a systems level, it's even more intractable to keep these things straight. It's easy to feel you're stuck in traffic. It's harder to feel you are traffic. And so this kind of containerization and the anonymity it permits and the way it cuts off consequences of our actions, I think is a really fundamental principle, and it's, I think, very much what's at play with a lot of the technologies we're increasingly relying on to communicate with and understand one another. They're fast and reactive. They're not live and connected. We're reacting sort of in the moment, and that tends to let emotions, as opposed to deliberative processes, rule. We're putting humans into containers. It makes it easier to forget that there's a person behind, and there's a lack of consequences. So I can fling a malignant tweet across the internet, and when it hits its target, it will have a human impact on the person who reads that tweet directed at them, but I won't be there to see the impact. And so I don't feel the consequences, not immediately, but it builds up.